It's the Side Quest Podcast.
Usually when we start looking into these massive historic political alliances, there's like this underlying assumption of a shared origin story, right?
Yeah, exactly. A sort of natural, inevitable friendship.
Right. Two nations with these deeply common values just shaking hands across the ocean, recognizing their mutual destiny, and, deciding to take on the world together. It's a really comforting narrative.
It is. And, I mean, it's a narrative that governments spend an incredible amount of time and money, frankly, cultivating.
Oh, for sure.
Because the idea of a organic partnership built on mutual respect from day one, that is incredibly useful for public relations.
Well, right. But then you start actually digging into the historical origins of the United States and the United Kingdom, and that neat little origin story just goes up in flames, like quite literally.
Regularly, yeah.
We're looking at two nations that started out actively shooting at each other, engaging in brutal warfare, and in one particularly memorable instance, burning down each other's Capitol buildings.
Yes, which is just wild to think about today.
It really is. So how do you go from setting fire to the White House to forging what is arguably the most dominant, famous, and deeply entrenched geopolitical alliance in modern human history?
I mean, it is the absolute definition of a geopolitical paradox.
Yeah.
And understanding how that paradox actually functions is, it's the key to understanding the architecture of global power today.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are taking a pretty epic journey through 250 years of history today for you, and we're doing it because of what is unfolding like right this very minute on the world stage.
Yeah, we've got a massive, really fascinating stack of sources to synthesize for this one.
You really do. We're pulling from a comprehensive historical retrospective of the UK-US special relationship. And we also have these incredibly detailed diplomatic dossiers that track the absolute roller coaster of a dynamic between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Keir Starmer from 2024 through the spring of 2026.
Right. And to bring it right up to the hour for you, we're incorporating breaking coverage from The Independent regarding their, well, incredibly tense, highly scrutinized interactions at this week's G7 summit in Evian-les-Bains.
Yeah, it's been intense. So our core objective for this deep dive is to unpack the true, often hidden origins of this so-called special relationship.
Exactly. We're going to trace the specific mechanics of how it evolved from a bitter, violent rivalry into a close, yet, as we'll see, highly asymmetrical alignment over the centuries.
But more importantly, we're going to examine how that deeply entrenched asymmetry is directly dictating the complex, super high-stakes relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Starmer today.
Because, frankly, we are bypassing the standard political talking points today.
Oh, absolutely. We're getting into the backroom deals, the royal interventions, the hot mic moments, and, the raw transactional mechanics of global power.
So, to fully grasp the tension radiating from this week's G7 summit, we have to start with a fundamental truth. This relationship was not born out of shared values. It was born out of conflict and eventually a very grudging, calculated necessity.
Yeah, grudging is definitely the word. To understand the friction we're seeing in 2026, we absolutely have to go back to the bitter beginnings. I mean, the American Revolution, stretching from 1775 to 1783, it was a brutal war of secession.
Right.
The 13 colonies fought the British Empire for their independence, and, they didn't do it alone.
No, not at all. They required massive financial and naval assistance from the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch just to survive.
Right. But then the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially ended the war, it didn't just magically erase all that hostility. I mean, a treaty is just paper if the realities on the ground don't actually shift.
And they really didn't shift.
Eh.
If you read the historical accounts, Britain essentially treated the United States like a rebellious teenager going through a phase, not a sovereign nation.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, they actually kept British troops stationed in forts deep on American soil.
In places like the Ohio Valley, yeah. For years after the treaty was signed.
Decades, almost. And they were actively arming Native American tribes to prevent American westward expansion.
Exactly. And out on the oceans, it was even worse.
Right, the impressment issue?
Yeah. The Royal Navy was locked in this life-or-death struggle with Napoleon's France, and they faced a severe manpower shortage. So their solution was this practice called impressment.
Which is basically state-sanctioned kidnapping.
That's exactly what it was. British warships would literally intercept American merchant vessels on the high seas, board them, and claim often with zero evidence, mind you, that the American sailors were actually British deserters.
Wow.
Yeah, they'd kidnapped these men and forced them into brutal service in the Royal Navy. It was a staggering violation of American sovereignty and maritime law.
Which, makes total sense why that inevitably boiled over into a second war, the War of 1812.
Right.
And here's a striking historical fact that gets conveniently glossed over at modern state dinners. In August 1814, British forces marched into Washington, D.C.
Yeah, this is wild.
They literally ate the dinner that had been prepared for President James Madison, and then they systematically set fire to the White House, the Capitol building, and the Treasury.
Just burn the nascent American government to the ground.
Totally. It was a profound psychological trauma for the young republic. So for much of the 19th century, if you had suggested to an American or British politician that these two countries would eventually form an unbreakable world-dominating alliance...
They would have questioned your sanity. Absolutely.
Right. The 1800s were defined by intense friction. I mean, they were commercial partners, yes, because the economic ties of cotton and textiles demanded it, but they were deeply suspicious geopolitical rivals.
I mean, look at the Oregon boundary dispute in the 1840s.
Oh, right.
The U.S. was expanding westward, driven by the whole concept of manifest destiny, and there was this massive, highly volatile, territorial dispute with Britain over the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, the political rallying cry in America was literally 54-40 or fight.
Exactly. They were fully prepared to go to a third war over a latitude line on a map.
Insane. And then you consider the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865.
Right.
The British government officially maintained neutrality, but the British aristocracy had, a lot of sympathy for the Confederacy.
And that sympathy translated into tangible, destructive action. British shipyards in Liverpool actually constructed advanced commerce raiders for the Confederacy.
Like the CSS Alabama, right?
Yes, most famously the CSS Alabama. These British-built warships devastated the Union merchant marine fleet. The political fury in Washington over Britain's indirect support for the South severely poisoned relations for decades after the war ended.
The U.S. eventually demanded and actually received massive financial reparations from Britain in international arbitration.
Yeah, the Alabama claims.
So you have a century of wars, kidnappings, border disputes, and literally funding each other's enemies. Structurally, it seems like neither side actually wanted an alliance.
Because structurally, neither side needed one. During the 19th century, the British Empire was the undisputed global hegemon.
Right.
The Royal Navy controlled the oceans, and London was the financial capital of the world. They pursued a policy of splendid isolation from formal alliances.
And on the American side, the guiding geopolitical philosophy, dating all the way back to George Washington's farewell address, was strict isolationism.
Exactly. The primary goal of U.S. foreign policy was to avoid being dragged into European power struggles at all costs.
So what changes the calculus? How do you go from pointing cannons at each other to sharing a foxhole?
The structural pivot, the moment the tectonic plates finally shift, happens in 1895. And it is sparked by something that seems incredibly obscure to us now, the Venezuela boundary crisis.
Right. There's a border dispute between Venezuela and the neighboring British colony of British Guiana.
Yeah.
And gold had been discovered in the disputed territory. And the United States decides to step in, invoking the Monroe Doctrine. Now, for you listening, the Monroe Doctrine was a policy from 1823, basically declaring the Western Hemisphere closed to further European colonization.
Right. But for decades, it was just words on paper.
Right.
The U.S. never actually had the naval power to enforce it.
Exactly. But by 1895, the U.S. economy had exploded. They were building a modern steel-hulled navy.
Yeah, President Grover Cleveland, Secretary of State, sent a shockingly aggressive diplomatic note to London, asserting American dominance in the Western Hemisphere and demanding Britain submit the border dispute to U.S. arbitration.
He essentially told the British Empire to back off or face war.
He really did.
So this feels like the ultimate test of the relationship. Does Britain push back? Do we get a third Anglo-American war?
They do not. Britain chooses to back down. They agree to the arbitration, effectively acknowledging American hegemony in the Americas. And this retreat marks the beginning of what historians call the Great Rapprochement.
It's kind of like, two high school rivals who spend years pranking each other, only to realize in their senior year that they need to team up against a new bully on the block.
That's actually a great analogy.
But wait, why would the most powerful empire on Earth just fold? Was this a sudden realization of shared Anglo-Saxon brotherhood, or was there something much more cynical going on behind the scenes in London?
Oh, it was pure calculating strategic pragmatism.
Shocker.
Yeah, British policymakers looked at the global board and realized they were severely overstretched. They were facing unrest in South Africa that would soon become the Boer War.
Right.
And more importantly, they were watching the aggressive industrial and naval rise of Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. The British realized that their long-standing policy of splendid isolation was becoming dangerous.
So they needed friends.
They needed friends, and they needed to consolidate their forces. They looked to the United States, a nation whose industrial output had actually just surpassed Britain's, and made a cold calculation.
Makes sense.
A stable, friendly United States dominating the Western Hemisphere was a much better strategic asset than fighting an expensive, unwinnable war thousands of miles away. Britain basically swallowed its imperial pride to secure its western flank.
Wow. So the late 19th century gives us this pragmatic thaw. The temperature drops. But it took the existential, world-shattering threat of 2 world wars to forge the actual machinery of the special relationship and to finally give it a name.
Yes, and even then, the transition was agonizingly slow. The isolationist instinct in the United States was deeply entrenched.
Super deep.
When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, the U.S. declared strict neutrality. For nearly 3 years, as millions died in the trenches, America watched from the sidelines.
President Woodrow Wilson actually won his 1916 re-election campaign on the incredibly popular slogan, "He kept us out of war."
Exactly. It's hard to imagine now given America's global footprint, but the domestic political gravity in the U.S. was overwhelmingly against helping Britain.
The U.S. only enters the conflict in April 1917, and it wasn't out of a desire to save the British Empire.
No, not at all.
It was forced by German strategic blunders, right? Like Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American merchant ships.
Yeah, and then British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram.
Oh, the telegram.
Yeah, a secret communication where Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico, promising to help Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if they attacked the U.S.
Which is just insane to think about. That is what finally tips the scales. American troops arrive, provide the crucial manpower to break the deadlock in 1918, and the war is won. But anyone expecting a permanent alliance to blossom from the ashes of WWI would be severely disappointed.
Very. The wartime partnership evaporated almost the second the ink dried on the armistice.
Yeah.
The U.S. Senate famously refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. America refused to join the League of Nations, the very international body Woodrow Wilson had championed.
So they just completely pulled back.
Yeah, the United States pulled its troops out of Europe, raised massive economic tariffs, and retreated right back into a profound period of isolationism throughout the 1920s and 1930s.
Leaving a deeply indebted, severely weakened Britain to manage a fracturing global empire on its own. Which brings us to the crucible of World War II. And this is the moment where the survival of the British nation literally depended on finding a way to drag the United States back onto the world stage.
Yeah, when France fell in 1940 and Britain stood completely alone against Nazi Germany, Prime Minister Winston Churchill made securing American entry into the war his singular overriding mission.
He knew they couldn't do it alone.
He knew Britain could not win alone. But he was dealing with President Franklin Roosevelt, who was politically handcuffed by a fiercely isolationist American public and an organized America First movement that vehemently opposed intervention.
So Roosevelt has to rely on these incredibly creative, almost legally dubious workarounds to keep Britain afloat without officially declaring war.
Precisely. You see the mechanics of this in the Destroyers for Bases deal in 1940.
Wait, so they traded actual warships for lease agreements?
They did. It was a raw, highly transactional agreement. The U.S. traded 50 aging, obsolete naval destroyers to the Royal Navy. In exchange, Britain granted the U.S. 99-year leases to establish military bases on British territories in the Caribbean and Newfoundland.
Wow.
It's a brilliant move by Roosevelt because he sold it to the American public, not as an act of war, but as a shrewd real estate deal that enhanced American national security.
And then you have the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, which basically allowed the U.S. to supply Britain with unlimited war materials, food, oil, weapons, on the promise of future repayment.
Right.
Roosevelt famously compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. You don't argue over the cost of the hose, you just want them to put out the fire before it spreads to your house.
Which is a brilliant analogy. But despite all of Churchill's desperate pleading and Roosevelt's maneuvering, It took the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to finally bring the United States fully into the conflict.
Right.
And from that point on, the level of integration between the two nations was unprecedented in military history. They formed combined military commands, coordinated global grand strategy, and shared deeply guarded secrets.
Which is exactly the environment that birthed the phrase we're dissecting today. Winston Churchill officially coined the term special relationship during his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946.
He did.
But let's look at this critically. Churchill, who was half American on his mother's side, was a masterful rhetorician. He understood the power of a brand. Was this special relationship just a clever marketing slogan designed to ensure a fading British Empire stayed relevant in a world now dominated by Washington and Moscow?
That is the crucial insight, actually. If you analyze the structural realities of 1946, the phrase was absolutely a brilliant forward-looking piece of diplomatic branding, and it was deeply self-serving. By elevating the partnership with a lofty emotional name, Churchill was attempting to mask a permanent, irreversible power imbalance.
Because the post-war reality was brutal for Britain.
Beyond brutal. Britain was victorious, but the country was financially ruined. They were heavily indebted to the U.S., their cities were bombed out, and their empire was beginning to dismantle.
And the U.S.
The United States, on the other hand, emerged as the undisputed economic and military colossus of the world, holding roughly half of the globe's total manufacturing capacity. Britain needed America desperately for physical security and economic reconstruction. America did not fundamentally need Britain in the same way.
So it was a massive asymmetry.
Massive. Churchill used the phrase special relationship to claim a status and influence and a seat at the top table that Britain's own diminished material power could no longer justify.
But the sources also point out that it wasn't purely rhetorical smoke and mirrors. There was a very real, tangible debt the U.S. owed Britain regarding the ultimate weapon of the war.
Right.
Think about the atomic bombs dropped on Japan.
Right.
Most people assume that was a purely American triumph of engineering, the Manhattan Project. But the reality is that the program relied heavily on British physics.
This is a vital piece of the institutional architecture. Early in the war, British theoretical physicists, working under the code name tube alloys, were actually far ahead of the Americans in proving that a uranium-235 atomic bomb was mathematically and practically feasible.
Wait, really? They were ahead?
Oh, significantly. In 1943, the British and American governments signed the Quebec Agreement, and the entire British nuclear research program was essentially folded into the American Manhattan Project. British scientists moved to the U.S. and worked directly on the bomb's development.
They literally handed over their foundational blueprints.
They did. And that level of deeply integrated scientific and intelligence cooperation set a profound precedent. Even though the U.S. temporarily cut Britain off from nuclear secrets right after the war with the McMahon Act, the precedent was set. It laid the groundwork for the permanent intelligence and defense sharing that continues to operate today.
And that perfectly bridges us into the Cold War era. Because that post-WWWI power imbalanced America as the superpower, Britain as the junior partner, created the physical institutions that still anchor the relationship.
Yes. But it also set the stage for some severe, deeply humiliating diplomatic ruptures that reveal the actual limits of the alliance.
The late 1940s and 1950s laid the concrete foundations. You have the creation of NATO in 1949, legally binding the two nations in a mutual defense pact. You have the UK-USI Agreement of 1946, which formally created the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network.
Let's pause on Five Eyes for a second because it gets thrown around a lot as a buzzword. What does that actually mean mechanically for you and me?
Mechanically, the Five Eyes, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, agreed to divide the globe into specific areas of responsibility for signals intelligence collection. They intercept communications, process the data, and then seamlessly share it across a unified, highly classified database.
So a British analyst at GCHQ can access raw intelligence intercepted by an NSA listening post and vice versa.
Exactly. It is an unprecedented surrender of sovereign secrecy to an allied nation.
Wow. And then you have the 1958 U.S.-UK Mutual Defense Agreement, which essentially restored the nuclear relationship. It allows the U.S. to share nuclear submarine propulsion technology and nuclear warhead designs with the U.K. The British independent nuclear deterrent, the Trident submarine fleet, relies entirely on American missiles.
So as you said, the deep state machinery is locked in, it is deeply integrated, but the political layer...
Yeah, that's where things get messy.
The political layer is where the power asymmetry makes itself known, sometimes violently. And there's no more glaring example of this than the Suez Crisis in 1956. This was a moment the illusion of equality was shattered forever.
Break down the mechanics of the Suez Crisis for us. Why was it such a massive rupture?
In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which was a vital maritime artery largely owned by British and French interests.
Okay.
Britain, viewing this as a mortal threat to its remaining imperial prestige and its oil supply, secretly conspired with France and Israel to invade Egypt and retake the canal. Crucially, they deliberately did not consult the United States.
They completely kept Washington in the dark, like zero heads up.
Zero. And when the invasion happened, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was absolutely furious. The U.S. was trying to court Arab nations away from the Soviet Union, and this imperialist adventure by Britain and France threatened to push the entire Middle East into the Soviet orbit.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, it happened at the exact same time the Soviets were brutally crushing a democratic uprising in Hungary, distracting the world from Soviet atrocities.
So what does Eisenhower do? Because he doesn't just send a strongly worded diplomatic cable. He utilizes raw, devastating economic leverage.
Eisenhower understood the financial vulnerability of Britain. The invasion had sparked a run on the British pound. The Bank of England was bleeding foreign exchange reserves trying to prop up the currency.
Right.
Britain desperately needed an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. Eisenhower ordered the U.S. Treasury to block the IMF loan. Furthermore, he explicitly threatened to sell off massive holdings of British sterling bonds held by the U.S. government.
Wait, so he sells those bonds, the value of the pound collapses.
Completely collapses.
The British economy craters. He is basically holding a financial gun to the head of the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden.
Exactly. It was a brutal, unsentimental exposure of reality. Facing total economic ruin, Britain was forced into a completely humiliating, unconditional military withdrawal from Egypt.
And Eden had to resign.
The prime minister had to resign, yeah.
Yeah.
Suez proved definitively that Britain could no longer act as an independent military power on the global stage without the explicit permission and backing of the United States.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
It really was. It accelerated Britain's transition from an empire to a compliant junior partner. And the lesson the British Foreign Office took away was burned into their institutional DNA. Never, under any circumstances, risk acting alone against Washington's wishes again.
But even when they do stay close, even when the relationship looks perfect on the surface, it's not a partnership of equals.
No.
Let's fast forward to the golden age of the 1980s. You have Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and President Ronald Reagan. On paper, they are the ultimate political soulmates. Oh, absolutely.
They share a fierce belief in free market economics, a deep anti-communist ideology, and they genuinely seem to adore each other personally.
Their personal chemistry was undeniable. They exchanged handwritten letters constantly. Reagan famously referred to her as his most dependable ally.
Right.
And during the 1982 Falklands War, when Argentina invaded British territory in the South Atlantic, Reagan provided vital, tangible support. The U.S. supplied Britain with advanced Sidewinder missiles, satellite intelligence, and aviation fuel that were crucial to the British victory.
But then just a year later, in 1983, the United States invades Grenada, a small island nation in the Caribbean.
Yep.
Now, to understand why this matters, you have to look at the mechanics of the Commonwealth. Grenada is a Commonwealth realm. That means the British monarch, Queen Elizabeth II at the time, was the official head of state of Grenada.
Exactly.
The Queen had a representative, a governor-general, on the island, and the U.S. military invades this territory with barely a whispered heads-up to London.
The sources indicate that Thatcher was privately incensed. The United States had launched a military operation into a sovereign realm of the British Crown without consulting the British Prime Minister. She actually got Reagan on the phone to express her deep frustration.
Because it completely exposed the power dynamic. It demonstrated that even the closest personal bonds, even absolute ideological alignment, did not guarantee Britain a veto or even the courtesy of consultation over American military action.
It was a stark reminder of asymmetrical interdependency. America's global strategic imperatives will always override British diplomatic sensibilities, regardless of who is occupying the Oval Office or 10 Downing Street.
And this dynamic reaches its absolute tragic peak with the Iraq War in 2003. Prime Minister Tony Blair makes the fateful decision to stand shoulder to shoulder with President George W. Bush.
Right.
Britain commits 46,000 troops to the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, largely based on the intelligence premise that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction.
A premise that, as history showed, was fundamentally false. The rapid invasion devolved into a bloody, protracted, an incredibly destabilizing occupation.
And the cost to Tony Blair's legacy was immense.
Oh, staggering. Millions of people marched in the streets of London against the war. Critics across the British political spectrum accused Blair of being Bush's poodle, a derogatory term implying that he had sacrificed independent British judgment and moral authority simply to maintain proximity to American power.
Think about the glaring irony of this position. The special relationship means that a British prime minister feels structurally compelled to follow the United States into a deeply unpopular, legacy-destroying war in the Middle East, absorbing massive domestic damage.
Yeah.
But the United States won't even give a courtesy call before invading a Commonwealth nation like Grenada. It frames the relationship as less special and more, subservient.
You are hitting on the core structural mechanism of the alliance. Historically, Britain pays a steep, sometimes fatal domestic political price for standing by Washington on the world stage.
Right.
They do this while gaining relatively little tangible leverage over how Washington actually behaves or forms its policy.
Yeah.
British leaders absorb the political damage. They act as a shock absorber to ensure the underlying intelligence and defense machinery of the alliance keeps running.
And the institutional scar tissue from the Iraq War, that deep domestic aversion in the UK to following America into conflict blindly, brings us directly to the present.
It really does.
Fast forward to today, and we see this exact historical power asymmetry and these exact same structural anxieties playing out vividly in the deeply unusual, incredibly high-stakes relationship between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer.
On paper, if you were to design a diplomatic pairing destined to fail, this would be it. It is one of the most mismatched pairings in the history of the alliance.
Like completely opposite ends of the spectrum.
Completely. You have Prime Minister Keir Starmer, a former human rights lawyer, a former director of public prosecutions. He is methodical, deeply institutional, highly cautious, and he leads the center-left Labour Party. His political base is intrinsically suspicious of American hegemony and largely despises Donald Trump.
And on the other side of the table, you have Donald Trump, populist, deeply transactional, freewheeling, openly hostile to traditional institutions, and completely willing to publicly humiliate long-standing allies who do not bend to his immediate demands.
Right.
They share absolutely zero ideological overlap. This is not Thatcher and Reagan bonding over free markets. This is not Blair and Bush bonding over a post-9/11 world order.
No, it is a relationship built entirely on cold, hard necessity. But Starmer, to his credit, recognized the structural reality of the relationship immediately. Even before the 2024 UK election, Starmer practiced a strategy of calculated, hyper-disciplined neutrality regarding Trump.
Which couldn't have been easy.
Right. When the Trump campaign publicly accused Labour Party staffers of unlawfully traveling to the U.S. to help the Kamala Harris campaign, it could have been a massive diplomatic incident.
A lot of politicians would have taken the bait and fired back to look strong for their domestic audience.
But Starmer didn't. He brushed it off as normal political volunteering.
Yeah.
He absorbed the friction, refused to escalate the rhetoric, and publicly, repeatedly insisted that he had a good, constructive relationship with Trump. He was laying the groundwork for a transactional partnership.
Which leads to what the diplomatic dossier referred to as the masterstroke, February 2025. Starmer is only the second European leader to secure a visit to Trump's second White House.
Yeah, this was huge.
French President Emmanuel Macron had just been there, putting on a highly theatrical, physically affectionate show. Starmer is only 8 months into his premiership. He lacks Macron's flair. He needs to prove he can hold his own and protect British economic interests. So what does he do? He bypasses the political grid entirely. He brings a handwritten letter from King Charles III, formally offering Trump an unprecedented second state visit to the United Kingdom.
The reaction documented in the sources was incredibly telling. Trump read the letter in the Oval Office and was visibly moved. He actually scrutinized the paper, checking for the monarch's signature, remarking, "That is quite a signature."
Wow.
Trump has a well-documented, deep-seated fascination with the prestige and pageantry of the British royal family. And crucially, no American president in history had ever been offered 2 full state visits by the same monarch.
It basically functions as a diplomatic circuit breaker. When the political wiring between two leaders is completely frayed and threatens to spark a fire, deploying the royal family bypasses the political grid and resets the baseline temperature of the relationship.
That's exactly how they use it.
Starmer realized, we have nothing in common politically. We are not going to bond over climate policy or labor rights. So I'm going to utilize the one asset I have that no other nation possesses, the British crown.
It was a brilliantly calculated move, tailored perfectly to the psychology of the target. Trump evaluates international allies transactionally, and he places a massive premium on personal prestige, respect, and pageantry.
Which makes total sense.
Yeah, Starmer swallowed any personal or ideological pride his labor base might have demanded and utilized the monarchy to secure the structural relationship. And initially, this strategy yielded massive substantive wins for Britain.
Real economic wins. In April 2025, Trump announces his sweeping Liberation Day tariffs, massive blanket tariffs on foreign imports that severely rattled the global economy.
Right.
But Britain gets a vital exemption. Starmer secures a US-UK trade deal offering tariff relief on British steel and cars, establishing fast-track customs for tech firms, and in return opening the UK agricultural market to US beef.
Which was a major concession by Starmer, as U.S. agricultural standards are deeply unpopular in the U.K., but it secured the broader economy. Furthermore, Trump affirmed his commitment to NATO during that visit, which was the single statement terrified European allies were desperate to hear.
Yeah, that was huge for Europe.
And Starmer even positioned himself as a trusted bridge builder, hosting Ukraine's President Zelensky in London ahead of a highly volatile Trump-Putin summit, trying to act as a stabilizing mediator.
And it all culminates in September 2025 with Trump's state visit to the UK. There is a warm press conference at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country house. Starmer projects the exact image of a highly functioning, deeply productive special relationship. He looks like a statesman who has tamed the tiger.
But as the history we just discussed with the Suez Crisis and the Grenada invasion clearly shows, personal charm, state dinners, and royal letters can only mask deep structural and strategic disagreements for so long.
Right, the honeymoon always ends.
The power asymmetry cannot be ignored forever. By late 2025, the relationship hits a brick wall. The cracks finally appear.
And strangely enough, the first crack appears over a tiny cluster of islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean, the Chagos Islands.
To understand the Chagos dispute, you have to understand the geography and the military logistics. The Chagos archipelago includes the island of Diego Garcia.
Okay.
Diego Garcia is one of the most strategically vital joint UK-US military bases on the planet. It allows US B-52 bombers and naval forces to project power across the Middle East, East Africa, and the Indo-Pacific. It is a linchpin of American global reach.
So in May 2025, the UK government agrees to resolve a long-standing legal dispute by transferring formal sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to the nation of Mauritius. But crucially, the treaty includes a provision to lease back the Diego Garcia military base for £101 million a year, ensuring military operations continue uninterrupted.
Right.
Now, the Trump administration initially blessed this deal. The State Department signaled approval, and Trump himself told Starmer in February that he had a feeling it would work out well.
But by January 2026, Trump's geopolitical calculus shifts, and he completely reverses course.
Why the sudden shift?
Well, he was in the middle of a broader, aggressive campaign of pressuring NATO allies. He was squeezing Denmark again over Greenland. He was threatening new retaliatory tariffs on France. And suddenly, he targets the Chagos deal. He posts online, calling the handover of the islands to Mauritius an act of great stupidity and an act of total weakness by the UK.
And instantly, the domestic political dynamics in the UK ignite. Nigel Farage, the populist right-wing leader in the UK who has deep ties to Trump, winganizes Trump's statement.
Oh, absolutely.
He starts warning the British public that this weak deal will invite American tariffs. The conservative opposition leader, Kemi Badenoch, attacks Starmer mercilessly in Parliament. The domestic pressure becomes unbearable. By April 2026, the UK government officially drops the Chagos deal entirely.
It was the first undeniable, glaring sign that the transactional warmth Starmer had cultivated had hard limits. Trump was entirely willing to publicly torpedo a diplomatic agreement his own administration had previously endorsed, simply because his assessment of Britain's broader loyalty and utility had soured.
He used his leverage to just override British foreign policy.
Yeah, exactly.
And the specific reason his assessment of Britain's loyalty soured brings us to the decisive rupture, the absolute breaking point of the relationship. February to April 2026, the outbreak of direct military conflict with Iran.
Yeah, this is where it all falls apart. In late February 2026, the United States enters into a direct, escalating military conflict with Iran following a series of proxy attacks.
Right.
Trump, operating under the historical expectation of this special relationship, demands immediate, robust, allied military participation. He expects Britain to be the first in line.
Of course.
But Starmer, facing a domestic audience deeply traumatized by the legacy of the Iraq War, declines. He stands before the British public and explicitly calls it not our war.
But he doesn't just decline to send British troops. He takes a step that fundamentally disrupts American military operations. He actively blocks U.S. military aircraft from using British sovereign air bases for offensive strikes against Iran.
This is a massive escalation of non-compliance. Think about the logistics. The U.S. relies heavily on air bases in the U.K., like RAF Lakenheath, and sovereign base areas in Cyprus, to launch and refuel bombers heading to the Middle East.
So Starmer's basically grounding them.
By denying base access, Starmer severely complicated U.S. Central Command's operational planning. He eventually partially relented after intense back-channel pressure, allowing U.S. planes to use bases in England and Diego Garcia, but only for specific, limited defensive strikes against Iranian missile systems that were directly targeting British allies.
So we have to look at Starmer's internal calculus here. He is leading a Labour Party where the ghost of Tony Blair's poodle label is a toxic political liability.
Right.
His voters absolutely refuse to be dragged into another American-led Middle Eastern war. Did Starmer find himself in a trap where he basically had to choose between surviving politically at home or maintaining the alliance in Washington?
If we analyze the structural realities impartially, and, it's crucial for us to understand the mechanics here without taking any political side, the answer is undeniably yes.
Yeah, just looking at the facts.
Starmer's domestic electoral coalition carries profound, deeply ingrained skepticism toward Middle Eastern military entanglements. Saying a swift, unconditional yes to Trump's demands on Iran would have caused a massive revolt within his own party and likely cost him his premiership.
He literally had to absorb the American fury to survive domestically.
Exactly. But choosing his domestic base triggered Trump's deeply transactional worldview. For Trump, an alliance is only as valuable as its most recent deliverable.
Right.
One high-profile no on base access completely outweighed a year of accumulated yeses on trade deals, royal visits, and NATO commitments. And Trump's retaliation was immediate, highly personal, and devastatingly public.
The rhetoric was brutal. At a White House press briefing, Trump explicitly stated, "This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with."
That is a surgical, highly calculated strike. He weaponized the very founder of the special relationship brand to imply that Starmer is historically weak, inadequate.
And he kept going. In an interview with the Sun tabloid, Trump stated the UK has been much different than France, deliberately praising other European countries to isolate Britain.
Yeah.
And the absolute low point comes in April on Sky News. An interviewer asked Trump directly to characterize the current state of the special relationship, and Trump responds with two words: with who?
With who? It is a complete public disavowal. And the diplomatic dossiers even cite reports of Trump mocking Starmer at a White House Easter lunch, doing physical impersonations of the prime minister, and mocking him for needing to consult his lawyers and cabinet too much before making military decisions.
And this isn't just reality television drama. There are real, tangible consequences for the everyday person. The friction between these two leaders is measurably damaging the British economy.
We have to look at the mechanics of the IMF downgrade. In the spring of 2026, the International Monetary Fund explicitly downgraded its economic growth projections for the UK. They dropped the 2026 growth forecast from 1.3% down to 0.8%.
Okay, wait. How does a diplomatic spat cause a half-point drop in national GDP? How does that actually happen?
It comes down to sovereign risk and capital investment. When the President of the United States publicly muses about whether an alliance exists, it creates massive uncertainty. Foreign direct investment freezes. Defense contractors hold back on joint ventures.
Oh, that makes sense.
And most importantly, the looming threat that Trump might revoke the UK's tariff exemptions out of spite chills the entire export market. The diplomatic freeze acts as a direct tax on the British economy.
Which brings us right up to this current week, the 2026 G7 summit in Evian-les-Bains. The tension between a deeply frustrated American president and an economically embattled British prime minister is playing out on the world stage, with every single camera dissecting their body language.
And the initial optics strongly suggested a deep freeze. There was no formal bilateral meeting scheduled between Trump and Starmer on the official itinerary.
Which is weird, right?
Highly irregular. In the context of a G7, past summits almost universally feature dedicated, highly publicized one-on-one time between the U.S. and UK leaders to project unity.
The media immediately seized on it, especially because of the hot mic moment. Starmer was caught on a live microphone at a session with other European leaders asking his aides, "Are they having a meeting?" referring to Trump holding separate, high-profile talks with French President Macron and Ukraine's Zelensky.
Oh, that wasn't a good look.
It painted a picture of Starmer completely isolated, peering through the window while the real power brokers made decisions.
It fueled intense global speculation of a deliberate, humiliating snub by Washington. But Starmer, clearly aware of the domestic damage this narrative was causing, pushed back fiercely. We have the breaking reporting from The Independent detailing how Starmer aggressively denied being sidelined.
Yeah, he tells the press pool, honestly, I mean, we've just spent 2 hours last night sat next to each other. He reveals that behind closed doors, they had an exclusive working dinner. No staff, no advisors, just the G7 leaders.
Right.
He claimed they had a frank and honest conversation about the geopolitical realities of Iran and Ukraine. And he insisted to the reporters, quote, "We get on really well."
The Independent reporters also pressed Starmer on the underlying policy disputes. They asked if Trump had confronted him over UK defense spending, especially relevant since the UK Defense Secretary had just resigned amid a very public funding row.
Right, which is a huge domestic issue.
Exactly. Or over Starmer's controversial domestic plan to ban social media for under-16s, which American tech companies and the U.S. government strongly opposed. Starmer flatly denied it. He said no and no and no.
He's just shutting it all down.
Completely. He maintained that they had spoken on the phone prior to the summit and engaged in multiple productive side conversations in the hallways.
He is doing everything in his rhetorical power to publicly downplay the friction and product stability. But behind the scenes, the UK government clearly understands that the political layer of the relationship is on incredibly thin ice. So, what is their strategy? They go back to the only playbook that works.
Yep.
They deploy the diplomatic circuit breaker. They play the royal card again.
Precisely. Because Starmer cannot fix the political friction caused by the Iran decision, the UK is deploying the monarchy to manage the optics. The upcoming King Charles state visit to the U.S. is being explicitly, heavily positioned by Whitehall as a stabilizing signal to the American public and the Trump administration.
And it's not just Charles, right?
No. Furthermore, they are planning a high-profile trip for the Prince of Wales, deliberately timed to coincide with the 2026 World Cup hosted in North America.
But when you look at this dynamic, you have to wonder about its sustainability. Whenever the politicians hit a wall or start publicly insulting each other, London just sends in the royals to smooth things over with a state dinner, a carriage ride, and some pageantry.
Right.
Can you genuinely repair a multi-billion-dollar trade vulnerability and a fundamental military disagreement over the Middle East with a fancy dinner?
This is where we have to separate the signal from the noise. The royal visits manage the public optics, but they do not solve the underlying policy divergence.
Okay, so what does?
Well, if you look beneath the surface noise of the hot mics and the tabloid insults, the true institutional architecture of the alliance has not broken. Despite Trump asking with who, on international television, the NSA and GCHQ are still seamlessly sharing highly classified signals intelligence through the Five Eyes network this very second.
Right.
The B-52s are still sitting on the tarmac at Diego Garcia. The nuclear submarine technologies are still being exchanged. The mutual defense commitments of NATO remain legally binding. The trade deal, for all the threats, has not actually been formally ripped up.
So it's the Suez Crisis and the Iraq War paradigm repeating itself. The public friction, the political insults, the domestic outrage, it all acts as a smokescreen, masking the fact that the deep state institutional machinery of the two nations just keeps humming along in the dark.
Exactly. The special relationship has never been a friendship of equals. It has always been a highly transactional alliance shaped by a profound, inescapable power asymmetry. It relies, historically and structurally, on British prime ministers absorbing intense friction and frequently suffering deep domestic political humiliation in order to protect that underlying security and economic machinery.
So Starmer is just doing what he has to do.
Yeah, Starmer's entire strategy since day one, brushing off the election interference claims, delivering the king's letter, taking the political hits over Iran without escalating the public rhetoric, is fundamentally about acting as a shock absorber to protect the base layer of cooperation.
When you look at your own life, it's easy to dismiss all of this as high-level diplomatic theater or elite political gossip. But the mechanics of this relationship dictate reality.
They really do.
It dictates global trade flows and the strength of your national economy, as we saw directly with the IMF growth downgrade. It dictates the security architecture of the entire Western world. When Washington and London are out of sync on military base access in the Middle East or arguing over defense spending within NATO, it fundamentally alters the strategic calculus for conflicts in Ukraine, in Iran, and across the globe.
The stability of the global markets and the deterrence of major conflicts are intrinsically tied to whether these two specific leaders can manage their structural historical differences without breaking the machinery.
It is a deeply, inextricably intertwined history. From British troops burning down the White House in 1814 to Churchill's genius branding exercise in 1946, right up to the tense working dinners and hot mics of the 2026 G7. The power asymmetry has always been the defining feature, but it feels sharper, more public, and more volatile now than ever before.
It definitely does.